Today, I'll define public policy and examine the policy process with a focus on how government decisions shape the business environment. Public policy is more than legislation or regulation. It reflects intentional choices about economic, social, and organizational priorities. For business leaders, understanding these choices is essential because policy can influence markets, competition, operating costs, and strategic opportunities. The central idea is that businesses do not operate independently of government decisions. They operate within an environment that policy continuously helps create structure and change. Public policy is the way a government responds to problems that affect society, whether those problems are real, perceived, immediate, or long-term. It includes deliberate action, but also deliberate inaction. Laws, regulations, executive orders, court decisions, and government programs all fall within this broader concept. Together, they shape the environment in which businesses operate, influencing expectations, opportunities, and constraints. It's important to remember that public policy is not only about what governments choose to do, it also reflects what they decide not to do. Public policy matters to business because it shapes both opportunity and risk. Market access depends on trade policy, licensing requirements, and antitrust laws, which determine who can enter a market and compete. Operating costs are also influenced by environmental regulations, minimum wage laws, and tax policy. Just as important, consistent policy frameworks reduce uncertainty. That stability gives companies greater confidence to invest for the long term and make strategic plans. In short, policy affects where firms can operate, what they pay, and how confidently they can grow. Public policy typically has four connected elements. First, problem recognition. Identify a social, economic, or environmental issue that warrants government attention. Second, goals and objectives clarify the outcomes a policy is intended to achieve and who should benefit. Third, instruments and tools describe how government will act, whether through taxes, subsidies, regulations, public spending, or persuasion campaigns. Finally, the target population identifies the individuals, industries, or groups the policy is designed to affect or protect. Together, these elements connect a public problem with a specific, intended response. Public policy does not appear overnight or move in a straight line. It develops through a structured, iterative cycle. First, agenda setting determines which issues receive attention. Next, policy formulation turns those issues into proposed solutions. Implementation puts the policy into practice, while evaluation examines its results and reveals what may need to change. The most important point is that this process is cyclical, not final. New evidence, stakeholder input, and shifting political priorities can lead to policies being revisited, revised, and reformed over time. Stage 1 is agenda setting, the point at which an issue gains enough attention to become a government priority. What gets placed on the agenda often determines what policymakers address first. Several forces can drive that process. Crises, scandals, and dramatic failures may push an issue forward very quickly. Interest groups and lobbyists, including businesses, advocate for the problems and solutions they care about. At the same time, sustained media coverage can shape public opinion and create pressure for policymakers to respond. Together, these forces determine which issues rise above the many competing demands on government. Stage 2 focuses on how a policy moves from ideas to an official decision. During formulation, legislators, agencies, think tanks, businesses, and the public work together to define the problem and design possible solutions. Because these groups bring different priorities, several competing proposals often emerge. Adoption is the point where one alternative is chosen through a formal process, such as a legislative vote, an executive order, or a regulatory ruling. That selection rarely reflects one group's preferences entirely. Compromise is almost always necessary. Stage 3 is policy implementation, where legislative intent meets operational reality. Adoption is not the finish line. Implementation is where policies succeed or fail. Executive agencies, such as the EPA, FTC, or IRS, translate legislation into enforceable rules and programs. At the same time, businesses must understand and adapt to those requirements, often taking on costs related to reporting, staffing, or operations. Implementation can also fall short when language is ambiguous, agencies are underfunded, or political resistance limits effective enforcement. At stage 4, I evaluate whether the policy actually worked, not just whether it was implemented. The central question is whether the intended goals were achieved efficiently, equitably, and without harmful side effects. I look at 4 areas: whether objectives were met, whether the benefits justified the costs, whether impact were distributed fairly, and what unintended effects emerged. These findings are not the end of the process. They feed back into agenda setting, where they can prompt adjustments, broader reform, or even repeal the policy. Policy is shaped by several groups, each with distinct role. The legislature creates and funds policy through laws, budgets, and oversight. The executive branch then puts those decisions into practice by enforcing laws, issuing executive orders, and directing regulatory agencies. Interest groups, including businesses, trade associations, and nonprofits, try to influence outcomes through lobbying and advocacy. Finally, the public helps determine political will, especially through elections and opportunities for public comment. Together, these actors shape both the direction of policy and how it is implemented. The key takeaways are straightforward. Public policy directly affects business operations, whether through government action or inaction. The process is cyclical, from agenda setting through evaluation, so companies should monitor every stage. And business is a stakeholder, with firms able to actively engage rather than simply react.